The rain poured down relentlessly, a cold drizzle that seemed to mirror the storm brewing inside her heart. Ella stood outside the restaurant, her chest heaving, as she tried to steady her breathing. The argument with Ryan had left her raw, exposed, like a wound reopened after years of scabbing over. She clenched her fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms, but it wasn't enough to distract her from the ache spreading through her chest. Ella had always been someone who wore her, emotions close to the surface. Too close, some might say. It wasn't just about this fight. It was everything leading up to it. Years of biting her tongue when Ryan criticized her career choices, months of pretending his dismissive comments didn't cut deep, weeks of trying to convince herself that maybe he was right, that perhaps she was failing at life because she hadn't climbed the corporate ladder or secured a stable paycheck by now. But tonight, something inside her snapped. Tonight, she couldn't pretend anymore. As she leaned against the damp brick wall of the building, letting the rain soak through her thin jacket, flashes of memories began to flood her mind. They weren't happy ones. These were fragments of a childhood spent tiptoeing around volatile adults, never quite sure if she'd done enough to earn their approval. Her father had walked out when she was 8, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. Her mother worked double shifts to keep food on the table, too exhausted to notice when Ella cried herself to sleep most nights. And then there was high school, the endless comparisons to classmates who seemed to have it all figured out while she struggled just to pass math class. Rejection became a constant companion, whispering cruel truths in her ear every time she dared to dream bigger than what others expected of her. But despite all that, or maybe because of it, Ella grew up fiercely independent. She refused to let anyone dictate her path, even if it meant taking risks that scared her half to death. After graduating college with a degree in graphic design, she turned down job offers from big firms, choosing instead to freelance so she could work on projects that truly inspired her. At first, it felt liberating. There was no boss breathing down her neck, no rigid 9-to-5 schedule chaining her to a desk. She could travel, explore new cities, meet interesting people, and create art that made her soul sing. For a while, it almost felt like she'd found her purpose, yet reality has a way of creeping in, doesn't it? Slowly but surely, the glamour of freelancing faded under the weight of financial instability. Clients ghosted her without paying invoices. Bills piled up faster than she could clear them. Friends stopped inviting her out because they assumed she couldn't afford it. And honestly, sometimes they were right. Worst of all, Ryan started treating her differently once he realized how unpredictable her income could be. What began as playful teasing, "Oh, another late-night project? Must be nice to set your own hours," turned into thinly veiled resentment. He accused her of being selfish, reckless, unwilling to compromise for the sake of their future together. Every word stung more than the last until finally, tonight, she couldn't take it anymore. "Why can't you just get a real job?" Ryan's voice echoed in her head, sharp and cutting, even though they were no longer face to face. "You're talented, Ella, but talent doesn't pay the bills." She shook her head violently, trying to banish the memory. Why did everyone insist on defining success the same way? Why did they assume stability equaled happiness? Didn't they see how much effort she put into her craft, how hard she worked to make ends meet, even when it felt like the world was conspiring against her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps splashing through puddles behind her. Instinctively, she turned, half expecting to see Ryan chasing after her. Instead, she found herself staring at a stranger, a tall man with broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her defenses. His dark hair was damp from the rain, and his tailored suit jacket hung loosely off, one shoulder giving him an air of effortless sophistication. Yet there was something undeniably approachable about him, something warm and genuine that softened the edges of his otherwise imposing presence. Before she could react, her foot caught on a crack in the sidewalk, sending her stumbling forward. Strong hands reached out to steady her before she hit the ground. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice low and steady, laced with concern. Ella nodded mutely, too flustered to form coherent words. Up close, she noticed the faint lines around his eyes, evidence of laughter or stress or both. His grip on her arms was firm yet gentle, grounding her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. For a brief moment, she forgot about Ryan, about the argument, about everything weighing her down. All that existed was this stranger holding her upright, shielding her from the chaos threatening to consume her. "Yeah, but I'm fine," she managed to stammer, pulling away slightly. "Thank you," he smiled softly, tilting his head as if studying her. "It's not every day I run into someone as determined as you seem to be," he said, his tone teasing but kind. "Though next time, maybe watch where you're going." Despite herself, Ella chuckled weakly. "Yeah, good advice. Thanks again." She hesitated, unsure whether to say more, but before she could decide, he pressed a neatly folded handkerchief into her hand. "For the rain," he explained simply, gesturing toward her soaked face. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt of electricity coursing through her veins. She blinked, startled by the intensity of the sensation, but when she looked up to meet his gaze, he was already stepping back. "Well, take care of yourself," he said, tipping an imaginary hat before turning to walk away. Just like that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing there with his handkerchief clutched tightly in her fist. For a long moment, Ella simply stared after him, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was that man? And why did she feel like she'd just experienced something significant, even though their encounter lasted less than a minute? Shaking her head, she tucked the handkerchief into her pocket and forced herself to move forward. Whatever just happened, she told herself, it didn't matter. Not tonight. Not when her entire world felt like it was crumbling apart. Little did she know, however, that this chance meeting would change everything. As Ella trudged through the rain-soaked streets, her mind replayed every word Ryan had thrown at her during their argument. Each accusation felt like a dagger twisting deeper into her already fragile sense of self-worth. She could still hear his voice echoing in her ears. "You're chasing dreams that don't pay rent, Ella. When are you going to grow up?" Those words haunted her, not because they were new, they weren't, but because tonight, for the first time, she couldn't silence them. Her steps slowed as she approached a dimly lit park bench tucked beneath an old oak tree. The rain had eased, slightly now a gentle drizzle rather than a torrential downpour. She sank onto the wet wood, ignoring the dampness seeping through her jeans, and pulled the stranger's handkerchief from her pocket. It smelled faintly of cologne, something clean and masculine, yet understated, for reasons she couldn't explain. Holding it brought her a small measure of comfort, as if the simple act of touching something belonging to someone else reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. Ella stared blankly at the darkened playground across the street. Its swing swaying lazily in the breeze. Memories flooded back unbidden, fragments of moments when life had seemed simpler, or at least less complicated. There was the summer she spent interning at a local design studio after college, working tirelessly on projects that barely paid minimum wage but filled her with pride nonetheless. Then there was the year she traveled across Europe, living out of a backpack and surviving on instant noodles just so she could immerse herself in cultures that inspired her creativity. Those experiences had shaped her, taught her resilience, and fueled her passion for storytelling through art. But somewhere along the way, reality had crept in. The bills piled higher, the rejections grew more frequent, and the pressure to conform became suffocating. Friends who once admired her boldness began questioning her choices. Family members hinted that maybe it was time to settle down and pursue something more practical. And then there was Ryan, whose initial support had slowly morphed into criticism disguised as concern. Ryan hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, he'd been charming, attentive, and genuinely interested in her work. He'd attended gallery openings with her, listened patiently as she explained the symbolism behind her designs, and even encouraged her to take risks. But over time, his patience wore thin. He started comparing her to his colleagues, people with steady salaries, retirement plans, and predictable routines. At first, Ella brushed off his comments, chalking them up to harmless teasing, but eventually the cracks began to show. His tone shifted from playful to condescending. His questions went from curious to accusatory, and tonight The dam finally broke. What hurt most wasn't what he said. It was the fact that part of her believed him. Deep down, buried beneath layers of defiance and determination, lived a tiny voice whispering that maybe Ryan was right. Maybe she was foolish for clinging to a dream that seemed impossible to achieve. Maybe she was selfish for prioritizing her passions over financial security. Maybe she was destined to fail. Tears welled up in her eyes again, blurring the neon glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles. She wiped them away angrily, cursing herself for being weak. Weakness was something she despised, not just in others, but especially in herself. Growing up, she'd learned early on that showing vulnerability only invited ridicule or rejection. So she built walls around her heart, fortifying them with ambition and independence. Yet here she was, sitting alone in the rain, crumbling under the weight of emotions she'd tried so desperately to suppress. And then there was that man, the stranger with the piercing blue eyes and quiet confidence. Who was he? Why did he seem so unaffected by the chaos surrounding him? Most importantly, why had his brief interaction left such a lasting impression on her? Ella shook her head, trying to dispel these thoughts. She didn't have room in her life for distractions, especially not ones involving strangers who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Besides, what could possibly come of it? A fleeting moment of connection in the middle of a stormy night. Hardly the foundation for anything meaningful. Yet, despite her best efforts to dismiss him, her mind kept returning to the way he'd looked at her, as if he saw something beyond the surface, something worth noticing. It had been ages since anyone looked at her like that. Not Ryan, whose gaze often carried traces of judgment or frustration. Not her friends, who viewed her as either an inspiration or a cautionary tale depending on their mood. Not even her clients, who typically interacted with her solely as a means to an end. This man, Alexander, though she didn't yet know his name, had seen her, really seen her, and for reasons she couldn't articulate, that realization unsettled her more than anything else that had happened tonight. The sound of distant thunder jolted her back to the present. Ella glanced at her phone, noting the late hour and realizing she needed to get home before the rain returned in full force. Reluctantly, she stood, tucking the handkerchief back into her pocket as if it were a talisman against the storm brewing both outside and within her. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to the days ahead. Would Ryan reach out to apologize? Did she even want him to? What would she say if he did? More pressing, however, was the question lingering in the back of her mind. What if she never saw that stranger again? And why did the thought of losing that brief connection feel like losing something far greater than she cared to admit? Before she could dwell too deeply on these musings, Ella reached her apartment building. The familiar creak of the lobby door offered little solace as she climbed the stairs to her fourth-floor unit. Her small studio was cluttered but cozy, filled with sketches pinned to the walls, half-finished canvases leaning against furniture, and stacks of books threatening to topple over at any moment. It was chaotic, yes, but it was hers, a testament to the life she'd fought so hard to build. She peeled off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in a blanket, sinking onto the couch with a sigh. Outside, the city buzzed with restless energy, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her. For a long while she simply sat there, staring at the rain-streaked window and wondering how everything had become so complicated. Then, almost instinctively, her hand drifted to the pocket of her discarded jacket. She retrieved the handkerchief and unfolded it carefully, running her fingers over the embroidered initials stitched into one corner, A.W. Two letters that meant nothing to her now, but might someday hold significance, or perhaps not. Either way, they served as a reminder that sometimes, even in our darkest moments, we encounter glimmers of light, unexpected connections that remind us we're not as alone as we feel. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Ella drifted off to sleep, the handkerchief clutched loosely in her hand. Little did she know, those initials would soon lead her down a path she never could have imagined. A journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, success, and herself. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets outside the upscale bar where Alexander sat nursing a glass of single malt scotch. The amber liquid swirled lazily in its crystal tumbler, catching the dim light of the overhead chandelier. He leaned back against the leather booth, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as if the space itself had been designed with him in mind. To anyone watching, he appeared calm, composed, a man entirely at ease with himself and his surroundings. But beneath that polished exterior churned a storm of thoughts and emotions that few would ever suspect. Alexander Whitmore was not a man who revealed much about himself, not even to those closest to him. At 38, he had built an empire. From the ground up, transforming a modest tech startup into a multinational conglomerate worth billions. His name was synonymous with innovation, ambition, and success. Magazines hailed him as a visionary. Investors clamored for his attention, and socialites vied for invitations to his exclusive gatherings. Yet despite all the accolades and adoration, there was a part of Alexander that remained perpetually out of reach, a void he'd carried with him since childhood, one no amount of wealth or power could fill. He often wondered what people would think if they knew the truth about him, the real him, not the carefully curated persona he presented to the world. Would they still admire him if they saw the boy who grew up in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, sharing a bunk bed with his younger sister while their mother worked double shifts to keep them fed? Would they respect him as much if they understood how many nights he spent studying by candlelight because they couldn't afford electricity? Or how many times he went hungry so his sister could eat? Those early years had shaped him in ways he rarely acknowledged aloud. They taught him resilience, resourcefulness, and the value of hard work, but they also left scars that never fully healed. Scars like the memory of his father walking out when he was 10, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. Scars like the guilt he felt every time he thought about the sacrifices his mother made for him. Sacrifices she never complained about, but that weighed heavily on her nonetheless. And scars like the emptiness that settled in his chest after losing Emily, the love of his life, in a car accident 5 years ago. Emily had been his anchor, the one person who truly understood him. She saw past the wealth and the titles, past the guarded expressions and calculated decisions, and loved him for who he was underneath it all. With her, he hadn't needed to pretend or perform. He could be vulnerable, imperfect, human. Her death shattered something inside him, leaving him adrift in a sea of obligations and expectations. Since then, he'd thrown himself into his work, using it as both a shield and a distraction. Relationships became transactional, friendships superficial, and emotions tightly controlled, but tonight something felt different. As he replayed the brief encounter with Ella in his mind, he found himself unable to shake the image of her tear-streaked face, her fiery determination, and the raw vulnerability she couldn't quite hide. There was something about her, something genuine and unguarded, that reminded him of Emily in the best possible way. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably striking. It was the way she carried herself, as if she were fighting battles no one else could see, but refusing to surrender regardless. Alexander took another sip of his scotch, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. He wasn't accustomed to feeling this unsettled, this intrigued. Normally, interactions like the one he'd shared with Ella would fade from his memory within minutes, dismissed as fleeting moments of insignificance. But this time, he couldn't let it go. Something about her lingered, tugging at the edges of his consciousness like a loose thread, begging to be pulled. "Who is she?" he murmured aloud, more to himself than anyone else. The question hung in the air unanswered, but it sparked a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wanted to know more, not because of obligation or strategy, but because he genuinely cared. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. Glancing at the screen, he saw a message from Thomas, his longtime friend and confidant. Thomas, still brooding over scotch? You need to get out more. Alexander smirked faintly. Tapping out a quick reply, Alexander, not brooding, just thinking. Thomas, about what? Or should I say, about whom? Alexander hesitated before responding. He trusted Thomas implicitly. They'd been friends since college, weathering everything from business ventures to personal crises together. Still, he wasn't ready to share the full extent of his thoughts just yet. "Alexander." "Nothing important." "How's your week going, Thomas?" "Dodging your questions as usual." "Fine, I'll drop it, for now. But don't think I won't bring it up later." Alexander chuckled softly, shaking his head. Thomas always had a knack for reading between the lines, even when Alexander tried to deflect. That was one of the reasons he valued their friendship so deeply. Unlike most people in his life, Thomas didn't care about his money or status. He simply accepted Alexander for who he was, flaws and all. Setting his phone aside, Alexander returned to his contemplation of Ella. What was it about her that captivated him so completely? Was it the intensity of her gaze, the way she seemed to look straight through him without hesitation or pretense? Or was it the fragility hidden beneath her fierce exterior, the sense that she was carrying burdens far heavier than she let on? Whatever it was, it stirred something in him, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, not since Emily. The realization startled him, forcing him to confront emotions he'd buried long ago. Could he really open himself up to someone new? Did he even deserve to, after letting Emily slip away without fully appreciating her while she was still here? These questions gnawed at him as he signaled for the bartender to pour him another drink. He wasn't used to uncertainty, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. In business, he thrived on calculated risks and strategic planning. Emotions, however, were unpredictable, an area where logic often failed and intuition reigned supreme. And right now, his instincts were telling him to pursue Ella, to learn more about her and see where things might lead. Of course, pursuing someone wasn't as simple as it sounded, particularly for someone like Alexander. His fame preceded him wherever he went, making genuine connections nearly impossible. People either fawned over him or resented him, neither reaction conducive to forming meaningful relationships. Even worse, he'd grown accustomed to keeping others at arm's length, afraid of being used or misunderstood. Opening himself up to vulnerability again felt like stepping onto thin ice, unsure whether it would hold his weight or shatter beneath him. And yet, despite these reservations, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward Ella. Perhaps it was foolish, reckless even, but something deep within him urged him to take the risk. After all, wasn't life about embracing uncertainty, about daring to hope for something better, even when the odds seemed stacked against you? With renewed resolve, Alexander reached for his phone once more. This time, instead of texting Thomas, he opened a secure app connected to his private investigative team. He typed a single line into the chat window: "Find out everything you can about a woman named Ella. She works as a freelance graphic designer and frequents areas near downtown." As soon as the message sent, a wave of guilt washed over him. Was this crossing a line, invading her privacy before even knowing her properly? Part of him recoiled at the idea, hating the implication that he needed to rely on his resources to connect with someone, but another part, the pragmatic, driven side that had propelled him to success, argued that it was simply gathering information. If anything, it would help him approach her with greater understanding and sensitivity. Sighing heavily, Alexander leaned back against the booth, closing his eyes as the weight of his decision settled over him. Tomorrow, he would have answers. Answers that might change everything or nothing at all. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Ella had awakened something in him, something he couldn't ignore. Outside, the rain began to ease, giving way to a soft mist that clung to the city streets. Somewhere in the distance, lightning illuminated the skyline, casting fleeting shadows across the room. Alexander watched the display absently, his mind still fixated on the woman who had unknowingly set his world spinning off its axis. Little did he realize, this was only the beginning. The neon sign above the bar flickered faintly, casting an uneven glow over the damp pavement outside. Inside, the atmosphere was dimly lit and intimate, with soft jazz playing in the background, and the murmur of conversations blending into a comforting hum. It wasn't the kind of place Ella usually frequented, too upscale for her budget, too polished for her taste. But tonight, She needed somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere far removed from the chaos of her life. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, shaking off the remnants of the rain before stepping inside. The warmth of the room enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the chill outside. Her eyes scanned the space, taking in the leather booths, the gleaming mahogany bar, and the patrons scattered throughout. Most were dressed in business attire, unwinding after long days at the office. She felt out of place in her soaked sneakers and wrinkled jeans, but she didn't care. Tonight, blending in wasn't the goal. Ella slid onto a stool at the far end of the bar, ordering a whiskey sour without hesitation. She needed something strong enough to dull the sharp edges of her emotions, if only for a little while. As she waited for her drink, she pulled out her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media feeds filled with curated perfection. Photos of friends traveling, couples celebrating anniversaries, colleagues landing promotions. Each image felt like a tiny jab, reminding her of everything she lacked. Her thoughts drifted back to the stranger from earlier, the man with the piercing blue eyes and quiet confidence. Why couldn't she stop thinking about him? Was it because he'd been kind to her when she least expected it? Or was it something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words? Either way, his presence lingered in her mind like a ghost, haunting her with questions she didn't have answers to. "Here you go," the bartender said, sliding her drink across the counter. Ella nodded her thanks, wrapping her fingers around the cool glass and taking a slow sip. The alcohol burned pleasantly as it traveled down her throat, offering a fleeting sense of relief. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to start over, to leave behind the mess of her current life and begin anew somewhere else, somewhere where no one knew her name or judged her choices. But then reality crept back in, dragging her thoughts down darker paths. What would happen if Ryan reached out tomorrow? Would she forgive him, try to salvage what was left of their relationship? Or would she finally admit to herself that they were better off apart? And what about her career? Could she keep chasing her dreams, even if it meant sacrificing stability and security? Lost in her musings, Ella didn't notice the figure approaching until he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" Her head snapped up, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, looking every bit as composed and magnetic as he had earlier, was the stranger. His suit jacket was gone now, replaced by a fitted black shirt that accentuated his broad shoulders. His hair was still damp from the rain, curling slightly at the edges, and his expression was unreadable, yet somehow inviting. Ella stammered, caught off guard by his sudden appearance. "Sure, I guess." He smiled faintly, sliding onto the stool beside her. "I hope you don't mind. I saw you come in and thought maybe we could talk." "Talk?" Ella echoed, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "Anything," he replied simply, signaling the bartender for a drink. "Or nothing, whatever you prefer." There was something disarming about his tone. Calm, unhurried, as if he genuinely wanted to hear what she had to say. It was a stark contrast to the rushed, transactional interactions she was used to, especially with men. Normally she would have brushed him off, retreating behind her usual defenses. But tonight she found herself lowering her guard just enough to engage. "So," she began hesitantly, swirling the ice in her glass, "do you always follow strangers into bars?" He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine, only the interesting ones. "And how do you decide who's interesting?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "That's the tricky part," he admitted, accepting his drink from the bartender. "Sometimes it's instinct. Other times it's the way someone carries themselves, their energy, their presence. With you, it was both." Ella blinked, momentarily speechless. No one had ever described her that way before, at least not sincerely. Most people saw her as either reckless or irresponsible, depending on their perspective. To hear this man, this enigmatic stranger, speak of her as though she were intriguing, almost captivating, sent a shiver down her spine. "Well," she said finally, attempting to mask her discomfort with humor, "you're either very good at reading people or very bad at lying." "I assure you," he countered with a wry smile, "I'm terrible at lying." They lapsed into silence for a moment, each sipping their drinks and stealing glances at the other. Despite the noise around them, the air between them felt charged, electric. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was significant, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the intensity of his gaze, which seemed to strip away her layers of pretense and see straight to her core. Or maybe it was the way he listened, not just to her words, but to the emotions behind them, as if he understood the weight she carried without needing her to spell it out. "You seem different," she ventured after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "From most people, I mean." "In what way?" he prompted, leaning closer. "I don't know," she admitted, shrugging. "You just don't feel fake, I guess. Like you're actually here, instead of half listening while thinking about your next meeting or whatever." His lips curved into a faint smile, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Let's just say I've learned the hard way that authenticity matters more than anything else." Before she could respond, the bartender interrupted, asking if they wanted another round. Ella hesitated, glancing at her nearly empty glass. Part of her wanted to decline, to retreat before things got too complicated. But another part, a louder, braver part, urged her to stay, to see where this strange connection might lead. "One more," she said quietly, surprising even herself. As the drinks arrived, their conversation deepened. They talked about everything and nothing. Her struggles as a freelancer, his travels around the world, their shared disdain for societal expectations. With each passing minute, Ella felt herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. There was no judgment in his gaze, no ulterior motive driving his questions, just genuine curiosity and empathy, qualities she hadn't realized she craved until now. By the time the clock struck midnight, the bar had grown quieter, the crowd thinning as patrons headed home. Ella glanced at her watch, startled by how quickly the hours had passed. "I should probably go," she murmured, though her body betrayed her reluctance by remaining rooted to the spot. Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want to?" he asked gently. "No," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, "but I probably should." "Why?" he pressed, his tone soft but insistent. "Because someone told you it's the right thing to do? Because it's safer than staying?" His words hit a nerve, striking at the heart of her insecurities. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let him see her cry again. "Because I don't trust myself right now," she confessed. "Because I'm scared of making the wrong choice and ruining everything." "You won't ruin anything," he assured her, reaching out to cover her hand with his own. His touch was warm, grounding, sending a wave of calm washing over her frazzled nerves. "Whatever happens next is up to you, but I hope you'll choose to trust yourself, even if it's just for tonight." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the world around them fading into insignificance. Then, without thinking, Ella leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft yet electrifying, tentative yet full of promise. Time seemed to stand still as they lingered there, suspended in a bubble of possibility. When they finally pulled apart, Ella's cheeks flushed crimson, and her heart raced wildly. I'm sorry," she stammered, mortified by her impulsiveness. "I don't know what came over me." "There's nothing to apologize for," Alexander said firmly, his gaze steady and reassuring. "If anything, I should thank you." "For, what?" she asked, confused. "For reminding me what it feels like to truly connect with someone," he replied simply. "Something I haven't felt in a very long time." Ella swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. In that moment, she realized two things. First, that this man, this stranger, had seen parts of her she kept hidden from everyone else. And second, that she wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets glistening under the pale glow of streetlights. As Ella and Alexander stepped out together, neither knew what the future held. All they knew was that something extraordinary had begun, and that it was worth exploring, no matter the risks. The morning light filtered through the cracks in Ella's blinds, painting soft golden streaks across her cluttered studio apartment. She lay sprawled on the couch, staring at the ceiling as fragments of the previous night replayed in her mind. Like a broken record, the bar, the conversation, the kiss, it all felt surreal, as though it had happened to someone else entirely. Yet the faint scent of cologne lingering on her skin and the crumpled handkerchief still clutched in her hand served as undeniable proof that it was real. Ella groaned, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as if it could shield her from the storm brewing inside her chest. What had she been thinking? Kissing a complete stranger, a man she barely knew, wasn't just reckless. It was utterly unlike her. Sure, she'd always prided herself on being spontaneous, on following her instincts rather than overthinking every decision. But this was different. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion or curiosity. It was something deeper, something that unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She sat up abruptly, tossing the blanket aside and pacing the small space. Her thoughts raced, each one more chaotic than the last. Who was that man? Why had he affected her so profoundly? And why did she feel this gnawing sense of guilt, as though she'd betrayed not only Ryan, but also herself? Ryan, just the thought of him sent a fresh wave of anxiety crashing over her. They hadn't spoken since their argument, and she doubted he'd reached out to apologize any time soon. Still, the memory of his accusations lingered, echoing in her mind like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. "You're chasing dreams that don't pay rent," he'd said, his voice dripping with disdain. Those words had cut deep, planting seeds of doubt that continued to sprout even now. And then there was Alexander, or whatever his name was. He was everything Ryan wasn't. Confident without arrogance, empathetic without condescension, magnetic without trying too hard. But that was precisely the problem. Men like him didn't exist in her world. They lived in glossy magazines and luxury penthouses, surrounded by people who catered to their every whim. What could someone like him possibly see in her? Was she just another distraction, another fleeting amusement to pass the time? Ella shook her head violently, trying to banish these thoughts. She didn't want to think about him anymore, didn't want to dwell on the way his touch had made her feel alive for the first time in months, or how his words had resonated with parts of her soul she'd long since buried. No, she needed to focus on reality, on the bills piling up, on her kitchen counter, on the freelance project deadlines looming overhead, on the fact that opening her heart to someone new, especially someone like him, was a recipe for disaster. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of his face from her mind. Those piercing blue eyes, the faint lines around them hinting at a lifetime of experiences she could only imagine. His voice, low and steady, laced with a sincerity that felt rare in a world increasingly dominated by superficiality. And that kiss. God, that kiss. It had been tender, yet electrifying, leaving her breathless and yearning for more despite her better judgment. Frustrated, Ella grabbed her phone and opened Instagram, scrolling aimlessly in search of distraction. Instead, she found herself typing his initials into the search bar, AW. Nothing came up. Of course it didn't. Men like him probably didn't have public profiles, preferring to keep their lives private and controlled. Still, the act of searching left her feeling foolish, as if she were grasping at straws in an attempt to hold on to something that might never materialize. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander sat in his penthouse office, overlooking the city skyline. The room was sleek and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the bustling metropolis below. Yet, despite the breathtaking scenery, his attention remained fixed on the single object resting on his desk, the handkerchief Ella had returned to him earlier that morning. He picked it up gently, running his fingers over the delicate fabric as if it held some hidden meaning. In truth, it did. To anyone else, it was just a piece of cloth, a token of politeness exchanged between strangers. But to him, it represented something far greater, a connection forged in the midst of chaos, a spark of authenticity in a world often devoid of it. Alexander sighed, leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes. He hadn't expected to feel this way. Not after Emily, not after years of building walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. Yet here he was, unable to stop thinking about a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours. A woman whose fiery determination and raw vulnerability had awakened something in him he thought was lost forever. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, rubbing his temples. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd spent years perfecting the art of detachment, of keeping others at arm's length while maintaining the illusion of connection. Relationships were messy, unpredictable, and ultimately unsustainable, at least for someone like him. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his empire demanded constant vigilance and unwavering focus. And yet, Ella defied every rule he'd ever set for himself. She wasn't polished or predictable. She didn't fawn over his wealth or status. If anything, she seemed oblivious to them, treating him as just another person, rather than the billionaire CEO he truly was. That alone was enough to intrigue him, but it was her spirit, her resilience, that captivated him most. Beneath her fierce exterior lay a fragility he recognized all too well, a quiet desperation to prove herself worthy, despite the odds stacked against her. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his reverie. Glancing at the screen, he saw a notification from his investigative team. They'd compiled a detailed report on Ella, complete with background information, social media activity, and professional achievements. Normally, he would have devoured such data eagerly, using it to strategize his next move. But now, as he stared at the file, he felt a pang of unease. Was this crossing a line? Invading her privacy before even knowing her properly? Part of him recoiled at the idea, hating the implication that he needed to rely on his resources to connect with someone. But another part, the pragmatic, driven side that had propelled him to success, argued that it was simply gathering information. If anything, it would help him approach her with greater understanding and sensitivity. With a conflicted sigh, Alexander opened the file and began reading. Each detail painted a clearer picture of the woman who had unknowingly turned his world upside down. Her struggles as a freelancer, her passion for graphic design, her tumultuous relationship with Ryan, all of it resonated with him on a deeply personal level. By the time he finished, he felt as though he understood her better than ever before. And yet, paradoxically, he wanted to know even more. As the day wore on, Alexander found himself torn between two opposing impulses. On one hand, he wanted to reach out to Ella immediately, to express his gratitude for the brief yet profound connection they'd shared. On the other hand, he feared scaring her away, overwhelming her with emotions neither of them was ready to confront. After all, she didn't know who he really was or what his life entailed. For all intents and purposes, he was still just a stranger she'd kissed impulsively in the heat of the moment. Ultimately, he decided to wait, to give her space, while simultaneously preparing himself for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain, he wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. Back in her apartment, Ella wrestled with similar doubts. Should she text him, apologize for the kiss, and chalk it up to a lapse in judgment? Or should she ignore it altogether, pretending it never happened and hoping he'd do the same? Neither option felt right, leaving her stuck in a limbo of indecision. By late afternoon, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted off to sleep on the couch, her phone clutched loosely in her hand. When she woke hours later, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadowy hues of blue and gray. Her phone lit up suddenly, startling her awake. Squinting at the screen, she saw an unknown number flashing across the display. Her heart skipped a beat as she debated whether to answer. Finally, curiosity got the better of her, and she swiped to accept the call. "Hello," she whispered. Hoarsely, "Ella?" came a familiar voice on the other end, deep, steady, unmistakable. Her breath hitched. "Alexander?" "Yes," he replied, his tone cautious yet warm. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," she stammered, sitting upright and smoothing her hair self-consciously. "I just wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I understand," he said softly. "I wasn't sure if I should call, but I couldn't stop thinking about last night, about you." Ella's cheeks flushed crimson, though he couldn't see it. "Oh," she murmured, unsure how to respond. "I know this might sound strange," he continued, "but I feel like we connected on a level I haven't experienced in a long time, and I'd like to get to know you better, if you're open to that." His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. For a moment, Ella considered declining, retreating back into the safety of solitude. But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her, listened to her, treated her like she mattered. Something about him felt genuine, trustworthy, even if logic screamed otherwise. "I'd like that," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. A smile crept into his tone. "Good. Then let's take it slow. One step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just us." "Us," Ella echoed, testing the word on her tongue. It felt foreign, yet strangely comforting, like stepping into uncharted territory with someone who promised to guide her safely through. As they ended the call, both hung up with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Neither knew where this path would lead, or whether it would end in heartbreak or triumph. All they knew was that something extraordinary had begun, and they owed it to themselves to explore it fully. Outside, the city buzzed with restless energy, oblivious to the quiet revolution unfolding within two hearts. Little did they realize, however, that their journey was only beginning, and that challenges far greater than either anticipated awaited them just beyond the horizon. The days following their phone call passed in a blur of anticipation for Ella. She replayed their conversation over and over in her mind, dissecting every word, every pause, searching for hidden meanings or signs that she'd misinterpreted his intentions. But no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, one truth remained undeniable. Alexander was unlike anyone she'd ever met. His voice alone carried a warmth and sincerity that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't thought possible. Yet, beneath that warmth lingered an air of mystery, a sense that he was holding something back, guarding himself against vulnerabilities he wasn't ready to share. Ella found herself oscillating between excitement and dread. On one hand, the prospect of getting to know him better filled her with a cautious optimism, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd stumbled upon someone who truly understood her. On the other hand, the nagging voice in her head refused to quiet down, whispering doubts about whether this connection could withstand the realities of their lives. After all, what did they really have in common? He lived in a world of luxury and privilege, while she struggled to make ends meet as a freelancer. Their paths were destined to diverge eventually. It was only a matter of time. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that certainly played a role. It was something deeper, something rooted in the way he listened without judgment, spoke without pretense, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. In a world where most interactions felt transactional, his authenticity stood out like a beacon of light in the darkness. When Alexander suggested meeting again, Ella hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself from potential heartbreak. But another part, a louder, braver part, urged her to take the risk. "What's the worst that could happen?" she reasoned with herself. "At least I'll have a story to tell." They agreed to meet at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was neutral ground, neither too upscale nor too casual, offering a safe space for them to navigate the uncharted waters of their budding connection. As Ella approached the entrance, her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. She tugged at the hem of her sweater self-consciously, wondering if she looked presentable enough. Not that it mattered. Alexander had already proven himself immune to superficial concerns, but still, old insecurities died hard. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Ella spotted him immediately, seated at a table near the window. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, his usual polished demeanor replaced by an understated charm that somehow made him even more attractive. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that sent a jolt of electricity coursing through her veins. "Hey," he greeted her warmly, standing to pull out a chair for her. "I'm glad you came." "Me too," Ella replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. She slid into the seat, clutching her bag tightly, as if it were a lifeline. For a while they chatted casually, skirting around heavier topics, as they eased into the rhythm of each other's company. They talked about books they'd read, movies they'd watched, places they'd traveled. With each passing minute, Ella felt herself relaxing, the initial tension melting away under the steady warmth of his presence. He had a way of making her feel comfortable, as though nothing she said could possibly disappoint him. But then, just as she began to let her guard down completely, Alexander shifted the conversation in an unexpected direction. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone suddenly serious. Ella's stomach dropped. She braced herself for whatever revelation was coming, her mind racing with possibilities. Was he married? Engaged? Did he have some dark secret lurking in his past? Whatever it was, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. "I want you to know who I am," he continued, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "All of who I am, because I think you deserve the truth." Her heart pounded in her chest as she nodded mutely, unable to form words. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "My name is Alexander Whitmore," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his confession. "I'm the CEO of Whitmore Technologies. You might have heard of it. It's a multinational tech company specializing in AI and software development." Ella stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. Whitmore Technologies? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but it wasn't until she connected the dots that the full magnitude of his statement hit her. Whitmore Technologies wasn't just any company. It was one of the largest and most influential corporations in the world, valued at billions, and featured regularly in business magazines and news outlets. And Alexander was its founder and leader. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're that Alexander Whitmore?" He nodded, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. "Yes, and I didn't tell you sooner because I wanted you to see me, not the title, not the money, just me." Ella sat there in stunned silence, her thoughts spinning wildly. Everything suddenly made sense. The tailored suits, the commanding presence, the subtle hints of wealth and power she dismissed as mere confidence. How could she have been so blind? More importantly, how was she supposed to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the larger-than-life figure she'd seen plastered across headlines? "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally, her voice trembling slightly. "This changes everything." "It doesn't have to," Alexander countered quickly, leaning forward, earnestness etched into every line of his face. "I'm still the same person I was when we first met. Nothing about me has changed except your perception of me." "But it does change things," Ella exclaimed, her emotions bubbling to the surface. You're a billionaire. Your life is completely different from mine. We live in two separate worlds, Alexander. What are we even doing here?" "I don't care about those differences," he insisted, his tone unwavering. "What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. You make me want to be a better version of myself. Isn't that worth exploring?" His words struck a chord deep within her, stirring emotions she'd tried so hard to suppress. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that their connection transcended the boundaries of wealth and status. But another part, the cynical, guarded part, whispered warnings of ulterior motives and inevitable heartbreak. "I need time to think," she said finally, rising from her seat. "I can't process all of this right now." "Of course," Alexander replied, standing as well. "Take all the time you need. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you won't write us off before giving us a chance," he said softly. "Because I truly believe we could be something special, if you'll let us." Ella nodded numbly, her mind still reeling. As she turned and walked away, outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos. Oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her, she wandered aimlessly through the streets, her thoughts consumed by questions she couldn't answer. Could she really pursue a relationship with someone like Alexander? Or would the gulf between their worlds prove insurmountable? As night fell and the city lights flickered to life, Ella realized one thing for certain: her life and her heart would never be the same again. The days following her meeting with Alexander passed in a haze of confusion and introspection for Ella. She retreated into her apartment, shutting out the world as she wrestled with the implications of his confession. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the earnestness in his gaze, the vulnerability in his voice, as he revealed the truth about who he was. It wasn't just the fact that he was a billionaire. It was the way he framed it, as though his wealth were incidental rather than defining. He hadn't wanted her to know because he feared it would overshadow the authenticity of their connection. And yet, now that she did know, everything felt different. Ella paced her small studio, her thoughts spiraling into a vortex of doubt and insecurity. How could someone like him, someone who moved through life with such ease and privilege, possibly understand what it meant to struggle, to scrape by on freelance gigs, to worry about rent payments, to feel the weight of societal expectations pressing down on you? Their worlds were oceans apart, separated by experiences and realities that no amount of empathy could bridge. And yet, there was something undeniable about the way he made her feel. When they were together, she didn't think about money or status or any of the external factors that usually dictated relationships. She thought about how he listened to her without judgment, how he seemed genuinely interested in her passions and struggles. She thought about the way his presence calmed her, grounding her in moments when she felt like she was drowning. But could those feelings survive the harsh glare of reality? Could they withstand the scrutiny of others, the inevitable comparisons and assumptions? These questions haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her resolve until she felt raw and exposed. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter, notifications piling up from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. Word had somehow spread about her encounter with Alexander Whitmore, thanks to a single photo snapped outside the cafe by an overzealous paparazzo. The image showed them sitting close, heads tilted toward each other in animated conversation. Beneath it, headlines screamed variations of the same theme: billionaire CEO spotted with mystery woman. Ella stared at the screen in disbelief, her stomach churning with a mix of embarrassment and anger. How had this happened? They'd been so careful to choose a quiet, out-of-the-way location, thinking it would shield them from prying eyes, but nothing, not even the most discreet corner of the city, was truly private when you were someone like Alexander. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello? Ella?" came a voice she hadn't heard in weeks, but recognized instantly. "Ryan, what do you want?" she asked flatly, her tone laced with irritation. "I saw the news," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Congratulations, I guess. You've traded up pretty quickly." "Excuse me?" Ella snapped, her temper flaring. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on," Ryan replied mockingly. "Don't play dumb. Everyone knows about your little rendezvous with Alexander Whitmore. Did you really think hooking up with some rich guy would solve all your problems?" "It's none of your business," Ella shot back, her cheeks flushing with indignation. "And for your information, we're not hooking up. We barely know each other." Sure, Ryan sneered. "Keep telling yourself that. But don't be surprised when he gets bored and moves on to the next shiny object. Guys like him don't stick around for long." His words stung more than she cared to admit, striking at the heart of her deepest fears. Was Ryan right? Would Alexander eventually tire of her, dismissing her as just another fleeting distraction? Or worse, would he use her as a trophy girlfriend, parading her around to boost his public image? Before she could respond, Ryan added, "Just remember, Ella, you're playing a dangerous game. People like him don't care about people like us. Don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he hung up, leaving her seething with a mixture of rage and self-doubt. For hours, Ella sat staring at her phone, replaying Ryan's words in her mind. Part of her wanted to dismiss them as jealousy-fueled nonsense, the bitter ramblings of an ex who couldn't accept that she'd moved on. But another part, a quieter, more insidious part, wondered if there was truth to what he'd said. After all, Ryan wasn't entirely wrong about the disparities between her world and Alexander's. Their lives were fundamentally incompatible, weren't they? As the days turned into a week, Ella avoided contacting Alexander, unsure of what to say or how to navigate the minefield of emotions swirling inside her. Meanwhile, Alexander grew increasingly concerned. He tried reaching out multiple times, sending texts and leaving voicemails, but Ella ignored them all, too overwhelmed to respond. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Alexander decided to take matters into his own hands. He showed up unannounced at her apartment one evening, standing outside her door with a bouquet of wildflowers and a look of quiet determination. When Ella opened the door, she froze, caught off guard by his sudden appearance. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tinged with both surprise and apprehension. "I needed to see you," Alexander replied simply, holding out the flowers. "I hate that we're letting fear and doubt get in the way of something real. Can we talk?" Ella hesitated, torn between slamming the door in his face and inviting him in. Ultimately, curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of hope, won out. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. They sat across from each other in her tiny living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavily between them. "I'm sorry if I scared you," Alexander began finally, his voice soft but steady. "I never meant to overwhelm you with my circumstances. All I want is for you to see me as a person, not a title or a bank account." "I know," Ella murmured, avoiding his gaze. "It's just hard. Everything about your life is so different from mine. I can't help but wonder if we're setting ourselves up for failure." "That's why I'm here," Alexander said firmly, "to show you that none of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be better. Isn't that worth fighting for?" Ella looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the sincerity etched into every line of his face. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he truly meant what he said. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away. It was a notification from social media, alerting her to a new post that had gone viral overnight. Her blood ran cold as she read the caption beneath a grainy screenshot. Of her argument with Ryan outside the restaurant, Alexander Whitmore's new girlfriend exposed, a gold digger who kissed him after fighting with her poor ex. The comment section was a cesspool of vitriol, filled with accusations and insults directed at her. Some called her opportunistic, others labeled her desperate, and a few even questioned whether their relationship was staged for publicity. Tears welled up in her eyes as she scrolled through the hateful messages, feeling as though the entire world had turned against her. Alexander noticed her distress immediately. "What is it?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Wordlessly, Ella handed him her phone. He scanned the post, his jaw tightening with anger as he absorbed the venomous words aimed at her. "When," he finished. He set the phone down gently and took her hands in his. "This isn't your fault," he said firmly. "None of this is true, and I won't let them tear us apart." "But how can we fight something like this?" Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "The whole world thinks I'm using you." "Then we'll prove them wrong," Alexander declared, his tone resolute. "Starting today, I'm stepping back from my company. I'm selling off parts of my empire and focusing on projects that matter, things that align with my values, not my wealth. If anyone doubts my intentions, they'll have to answer to me." Ella stared at him, stunned by the magnitude of his declaration. "You'd really do that? Give up everything you've worked for?" "I'd give up anything for someone worth loving," he replied simply. "And you, Ella, are worth every sacrifice." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized the depth of his commitment. In that moment, she understood that love wasn't about perfection or compatibility. It was about choosing to stand by someone, flaws and all, even when the world tried to drive you apart. Outside, the rain began to fall once more, washing away the remnants of doubt and fear. Inside, two hearts beat as one, united by a bond stronger than any storm. The weeks that followed were transformative, not just for Ella and Alexander individually, but for the foundation of their relationship. In the face of relentless public scrutiny and private doubts, they chose to stand firm, proving to themselves and the world that their connection was built on something far deeper than wealth or fleeting attraction. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, with external forces constantly trying to pull them apart. But together, they discovered a strength neither had known existed within themselves until now. Alexander kept his promise. He began divesting from parts of his empire, selling off lucrative ventures that no longer aligned with his values. Instead, he poured resources into philanthropic projects aimed at uplifting underprivileged communities, building schools, funding scholarships, and supporting small businesses struggling to survive. These efforts weren't just about distancing himself from his billionaire persona, they were about reclaiming his humanity, rediscovering the boy who once dreamed of making a difference rather than merely accumulating wealth. For Ella, watching this transformation unfold was both humbling and inspiring. She saw glimpses of the man behind the title, the one who carried scars of his own, who yearned for purpose beyond profit, and in turn she allowed herself to be vulnerable with him, sharing pieces of her soul she'd guarded fiercely for years. Together, they created a safe space where authenticity reigned supreme, a sanctuary free from judgment, expectation, or pretense. But healing didn't happen overnight. The backlash from Alexander's decision rippled outward, drawing criticism from board members, investors, and even some friends who couldn't understand why he would jeopardize his legacy for a girl. Meanwhile, Ella faced her own battles, grappling with guilt over being labeled as the catalyst for his choices. Late-night conversations became a staple of their routine, during which they unpacked fears, insecurities, and hopes for the future. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of a rented cabin nestled deep in the countryside, Ella finally voiced the question that had lingered unspoken between them. "Do you ever regret this? Giving up so much for us?" Alexander turned to look at her, his expression soft yet unwavering. "Regret implies loss," he said gently, "and I haven't lost anything. If anything, I've gained everything, because I have you." His words struck a chord deep within her, dissolving the last remnants of doubt that had clung stubbornly to her heart. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully embrace the idea that love wasn't about perfection or balance. It was about growth, sacrifice, and mutual respect. Their differences didn't define them. Their willingness to bridge those gaps did. As autumn painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, they made a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. They sold their respective properties, one a sleek penthouse overlooking the city skyline, the other a modest studio filled with sketches and memories, and purchased a quaint farmhouse surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. It was a place untouched by the chaos of urban life, offering solitude and simplicity in equal measure. Moving in together marked a new chapter in their journey, one defined not by titles or expectations, but by shared dreams and quiet moments. Each day brought opportunities to learn more about each other, to celebrate victories, navigate challenges, and build a life rooted in authenticity. Ella continued her freelance work, channeling her creativity into projects that resonated with her passions. Alexander, meanwhile, focused on mentoring young entrepreneurs, using his experience to guide others without imposing his influence. Their home became a reflection of their partnership, imperfect yet beautiful, cluttered yet cozy. Sketches pinned to the walls mingled with photographs capturing candid moments of laughter and tenderness. Books stacked haphazardly on shelves told stories of adventures past and aspirations yet to come. Even the garden outside bore witness to their bond, with flowers planted side by side, symbolizing unity amidst diversity. Yet perhaps the most profound testament to their love came not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday acts of kindness that bound them together. Alexander learned to appreciate the art of slowing down, finding joy in mornings spent sipping coffee while Ella sketched at the kitchen table. Ella, in turn, embraced spontaneity, encouraging Alexander to take risks, not financially, but emotionally, by opening up about his fears and vulnerabilities. One crisp morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows and birds chirped cheerfully, outside they stood together in the backyard, planting a tree whose branches would someday stretch toward the sky. It was a symbolic act representing not only their commitment to each other, but also their desire to nurture something enduring, a legacy of love, resilience, and hope. "This feels right," Ella murmured, brushing dirt from her hands as she gazed at the sapling before them. "Like we're building something real." "We are," Alexander agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Something that will grow stronger with time." In that moment, surrounded by nature's quiet beauty and the warmth of their shared presence, they understood what true fulfillment meant. It wasn't about achieving societal standards of success or conforming to others' definitions of happiness. It was about finding someone who saw you, truly saw you, and choosing to walk alongside them hand in hand through whatever storms lay ahead. Back in the city, whispers of their unconventional romance continued to circulate, though fewer people paid attention now. Some dismissed it as a phase, predicting that their fairy tale would eventually crumble under the weight of reality. Others admired their courage, seeing in their story a reminder that love transcends boundaries when nurtured with sincerity and trust. For Ella and Alexander, none of that mattered anymore. They had found solace in each other, creating a world where titles held no power and wealth carried no weight. Their journey hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been fraught with challenges that tested their resolve at every turn. But through it all, they emerged stronger, braver, and more deeply connected than either had thought possible. As winter approached, blanketing the countryside in a soft layer of snow, they sat together by the fireplace, wrapped in blankets and basking in the quiet comfort of each other's company. Outside, the world buzzed with its usual chaos, oblivious to the peace that reigned within their little corner of existence. "Do you think we'll always feel like this?" Ella asked softly, her head resting against Alexander's shoulder. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I do know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And in that simple declaration lay the essence of their love, a promise to navigate life's uncertainties side by side, embracing both its joys and its sorrows with open hearts and unwavering faith.